Hello, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar hosted by EUPATI. My name's Josephine Tapper. I'm a fellow of EUPATI, but also involved in engagement in pharmaceutical and medical device regulation. I think we're here because EUPATI, as probably most of you now know, have got a real sort of in-depth experience with patient engagement in pharmaceuticals. And as we all know, medical devices are becoming ever more part of our own lives. They can range from the very simple right up to in vitro. So I think the time is right to have a sort of deeper dive into patient involvement. And this is part of the also sort of EUPATI are developing and have developed a program of training in medical devices. So hopefully some of the outputs from this will involve that moving forward. So I would like to introduce, so the shape of today will be, we will hear some presentations and then have a more in-depth panel discussion. And then towards the end, have some questions, audience questions. So please feel free to put those. There's a box rather than the chat box, the Q&A box. If you can all keep keep yourselves mute, that would be great. It might well be that we can't respond to every question, but we will capture them and hopefully be able to answer those and share that later on. Post this meeting, and we'll also be capturing feedback. So I would like to hand over. So we think that it's really important to have, thank you, Jana, for sharing the slides. So we're going to look at the roadmap on medical devices from the EUPATI perspective. Bruno Gargo, who's based in Aveiro in Portugal. Can I hand over to you, please, Bruno?
Hi, thank you, Josephine, for passing it, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to give this small talk about how EUPATI sees the roadmap for involvement of patients in medical devices. I am a professor in the University of Aveiro. I have a training in pharmacy and a PhD also in pharmacy, and for more than 10 years now that I am working in the development, in the regulatory part of development of medical devices. And also, I am involved in with EUPATI for this time because I started to work with training programs for the pharmaceutical side, but with the specialization in medical devices, I start to be more and more involved in this sector. And also because I am the father of a small child with a rare disease motive, that's why I'm part of the national platform for EUPATI in Portugal. I'm a member of the board and I'm working with them since 2017 when this association was created. But for today, I was invited to give a small talk about the EUPATI roadmap. So, Jenna, if you could move for the next slide, I would appreciate. Okay, next, yes. Here, my first slide. As I told you, I start to be very near about medical devices, and since the beginning, I also had always had a problem with how the information in medical devices is developing and how it is available for everyone. And even when I start working, it was hard for a scientist or even someone that was doing research on the medical device field to have access to information, for example, instructions for use of medical devices, even for the medical doctors or even for the health professionals. So if you don't have access to the medical device itself, at the time it was also hard to have information about it. So I start to thinking to myself, that's why I'm involved in this topic, how patients are being involved not only in the creation of all this information, but also in the creation and development of medical devices. And the experience with the pharmaceutical industry bring me to this new challenge. We know that patient involvement is widely recognized in the development of drugs. So pharmaceutical industry for a long time now that is have been involving patients in the development of pharmaceuticals, but the development in the medical devices is not so promising or so implemented. So next slide, Jenna, please. That's why we have here a small gap that makes that this involvement in medical device remain very limited. Because the medical device sector is also very different from the drug sector, and we have here different stages of development that make this a really new, different field for involvement and for development of products. So we have a gap that needs to be fulfilled. Next slide, Jenna, please. And what are the responses? Why this gap exists? We know that we have a limited active participation of patients in the medical device development cycle. And this is because the sector does not involve in a systematic way, patients in all stages of development. And this lack of actively bringing patients for the development of these technologies makes that sometimes many medical devices are in the market and they are not responding to the medical to patients' preferences because they were not taken in consideration during this development. Also, because in the sector, we are still having a traditional focus on the technical and data and clinical data, and not, and sometimes we overlook patient perspective. We are looking very closely to the data that we are gathering from the clinical studies, from the technical reports that we get, and we focus on that and we forget to look what patients' perspectives are important here. And once again, this makes devices that are not user-friendly for the patients, that are not accessible, and sometimes not aligned with the patient preferences. Another important gap is while regulatory recognition exists, content authorities are more and more saying that and making mandatory that patients must be involved in all life cycle of medical devices. This is not quite well implemented in the field. We know that we need to do it, but we are still learning how we can bring patients to all stages of medical devices development. And another important aspect, and I bring here, that's why it's so specific, is patient-reported outcomes. Also, this is a very important tool and is very well recognized that is a vital form of assessing the true value of medical devices and how they work for the patient. We still need to work in a consistent way to standardize the use of this tool. This is going to be a very important tool, but we need to be sure that it is harmonized for all, so that we can compare different types of studies, that these tools, the inclusion of new technologies in patient-reported outcomes, taking in consideration the patient population, because, for example, we are introducing several digital pros, and with them, new challenges came to the table for the patients. So we need to incorporate patients on all these aspects. Also, the aspect of having global trials and global studies that involve different culture and different countries. We need to be sure that all the tools that we are implementing in these patient-reported outcomes are very well validated, and that the results that we get from there really represent the patient perspective, and that can be compared and used in the global section. So there are a lot of challenges that are making difficult, that were not were like obstacles to bring patients easily to the of development of medical devices. Next slide, please. Jana, next slide. Oh, sorry. Yes, thanks. This one. Due to this, EUPATI several years ago started to develop a roadmap for patient engagement in medical devices and in vitro medical devices, and a concept roadmap was created. We are now discussing and working on this roadmap to develop and make sure that it is completely aligning with all the new regulatory framework. So this is the concept that was created some years ago and that are now available at EUPATI training courses. And as you can see here, just like in the drug development roadmap, we have here two sections where we can see the participation of patients or the engagement of patients in the medical devices life cycle. We can participate with a medium experience population, where patients don't need to be experts or high experience in the technology that's being evaluated. And also we have a section on the top where we can see the engagement of high expertise patients that contribute to it, exactly as it was planned for the drug development roadmap. On the other side, if you look for the medicines development roadmap, the sections and the stages are quite different from the medical devices. We know that developing a medical device is quite different from developing a medicine, and due to that, we could not create the similar road. Actually, we try to avoid comparison between both of them. For medical devices, there's a lot of sections that need to be taken in consideration, and we need to understand that in this sector we need to involve different disciplines that on the medical device section are not so usually present. For example, when we are developing a medicine, it's easy to understand that patients will normally go easily professionals that are involved in the development, that are in the health sector, that are health professionals, scientists from life sciences. When we came to medical devices, we have all kinds of professionals and all kinds of expertise. And it's very easy to have a patient talking with engineers, informatics, and other types of professionals that normally are not present in the discovery phase, for example, or the initial development phases for medicines. That's why it's quite different to have the involvement of patients here. And if we can look here, we see that patient participation, engagement is crucial in all steps of development. Always in the beginning, in the preclinical part, in the clinical, and after in the post-market part. For the discover and to bring new ideas to this sector, the participation is crucial because the patients are the population that most understand the needs of that disease, and they know exactly what are the preferences that they have for that medical devices. Also, they can help the scientists to make a gap analysis and to match the unmet medical needs with the discoveries that we are having in the laboratory, for example. Another important thing is that the process is very interactive. When you go to the next step, and we are now trying to have a prototype or to move from an idea to a product, we have here a lot of interactions with patients and the professionals. And that are very important. The expertise of the patients are very important for the development of the studies so that we can test our product in the lab, that we can test our product in preclinical settings to make the right verification and validations, to design the correct clinical studies that will help us to understand if the medical device is actually useful for that patient population, and they are the best ones that could bring us the ideas of the needs they have. And for example, the participation of patients in this part is quite for the correct protocol, for the information that are in informed consent, for information that are in the instruction for use. They are the ones that will bring their own experience from day to day. Another also important part is that when we move to market, this experience and this interaction that we have along all these sites are very, very useful to guarantee that in the end, the product that is being developed actually meets the needs for the population, but also for the preferences that the patients have to use. For example, more and more digital tools are being integrated in all types or all forms of medical devices. We all imagine that this is a good thing, but we need to know if the usability of these tools are aligned with the needs and the preference for the population that are using these medical devices. And you need to have that in consideration, not only in the end when we have the product already in the market, but also when the product is already being developed. So it's quite important, and then I'm not going to tell you about all the boxes and the points in this roadmap that you can actually look, but you can see that patients are all important in all these aspects. Another important thing in medical device is that nowadays, with the regulations that are implemented in Europe, for high-risk medical devices, we need to be a more scrutinous approach to bring them to market. And the participation of the patients' opinions and perspectives in these discussions and evaluation of the reports that we get from the clinical studies or the clinical evaluation report is quite critical to allow the medical device to go forward. And this was not happening in the past. So now it's quite a very, very interesting aspect from our regulatory perspective. Next slide, Jenna. So as a take-home message, because you gave me 10 minutes, I have to leave you with these three pillars. First, the involvement is quite essential throughout the device life cycle. It's seen in the past, like one interaction along the life cycle. It's not that one interaction with one study, bring patients to discuss what they like to have in the medical device. No, it needs to be in all sectors of development. Patients must be involved in the idea, in the discovery, during the preclinical and the design of the medical devices to guarantee that is aligned with what they are expecting to see, for the development of the clinical studies, the protocols, the endpoints that are going to, the measures that are going to be made, the way the data will be gathered during the clinical research, for the clinical reports, to guarantee that the outcomes that we are measuring are quite clinical relevant for that population, and they reflect the preference of the patients, and also post-marketing when the product is already in the field and the patients are using it. The utilization of the product is part of the medical device development is most used, the one that we see that is most evident, but we need to be sure that these tools are being used all over from the beginning when they are possible to be integrated. Another pillar is that the input of the patients is critical to improve the medical device design, their adoption, also the results. If we develop a medical device that is aligned with patient preference and needs, they are going to use it more constantly, they are going to adopt it more, and if they adopt it and use it well, results will reflect better the safety and the performance of the medical device. So this is critical, this is why patients must be involved since the beginning. And also this must be a collaborative partnership. And because this will optimize, and this must be a true collaborative partnership, not only apply with the roles that the regulatory demands. Patients must be involved, decisions must be shared, and responsibilities are shared, and this must be transparent. We need to know exactly where patients were involved, in what aspect of the development, in what decisions made, and this must be knowledge to everyone. So these are my takeaway messages. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno, for such a sort of very detailed and for packing so much in, and really useful takeaways. I'd like to invite Tom Melvin, Professor Tom Melvin, who's going to speak to us from a regulatory perspective. Tom, if you can introduce yourselves, and the floor's yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josephine. Hello, everyone. Tom Melvin is my name. I'm a medical doctor by profession, and I spent 7 years working as a regulator in medical devices. For the past 3 years or so, I've worked as an academic. So I work as Associate Professor in Medical Device Regulatory Affairs at the School of Medicine in Trinity College Dublin. And this month, I took over as Chair of the Regulatory Affairs Committee of the Biomedical Alliance in Europe. We could go to the next slide just to introduce the Biomedical Alliance. So at Biomedical Alliance, we're a unique initiative that consists of 35 European-based clinical associations. So together we represent about 400,000 researchers and health professionals. At Biomed, our main job is to bring a common voice on behalf of those members, especially to policy discussions. And today we'll be talking about our activities for medical devices. We represent the full translational value chain from basic scientific research through to clinical treatment, and we promote European biomedical research and translational development for the benefit of patients. Next slide, please. So here on this slide, you can just see the different member organizations that make up Biomedical Alliance. So we have a good spread across most of the clinical specialisms. Next slide, please. So what I would like to do today is to introduce a project called CoreMD. CoreMD stands for Coordination of Research and Evidence for High-Risk Medical Devices. So we'll give a brief overview of that project, and in the second part of the talk, we'll focus in on some of the challenges that people dialing in today. Apologies, I'm getting a connection problem here. Sorry, Josephine, if we could go if we could go through to the next slide. Perfect. Hopefully,
brilliant. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. So medical devices represent a great diversity of technology, covering everything from simple products like wheelchairs right through to high-risk permanent implants like total artificial hearts. We estimate that there's about 500,000 medical devices available in Europe at the moment. Next slide, please. So we could go through to the next slide as well. So in the CoreMD project, we had a broad consortium that had membership from clinical associations, regulators, public scientific institutes, health technology assessments, notified bodies, as well as patient representatives with the European Patients Forum. The project run from 2021 until the summer of 2024. Next slide, please. And just to give a brief overview of the activities in the project, if we start in the bottom left side of the screen, we firstly looked at existing methods that are used, and then we examined possible new methods for clinical evidence generation. We looked at real-world data that's available to support medical devices from activities like registries, big data, etc. And we had a lot of activity in the project with respect to networking, to engage across the different interested communities from academia and science to clinical associations, regulators, and patients. Next slide, please. When we think about clinical evidence generation for medicines versus medical devices, in this graphic here, you can see a typical development cycle for a new medicine. Medicines go through a phased development approach from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 3. And at phase 3, you typically have a double-blind randomized controlled trial. And that's the typical type of clinical study design that you need to justify the marketing of a new medicine. We could go to the next slide. When we think about medical devices, things are quite different. So firstly, there isn't a standardized phasing approach for clinical evidence generation, although we do have some taxonomy now for pilot and pivotal stages of clinical development. The evidence standard provided in regulations is different between medicines and medical devices. Medicines demonstrate safety and efficacy, which is a demonstrable benefit in the context of a trial, whereas with medical devices, we have the safety and performance standard, which can be provided by generating evidence from trials, but in some cases, you can also claim equivalence to other marketed devices. A really important difference with medical devices is that making small design changes or iterating the device is very common, and that's not something that typically happens for medicinal products. And you can also claim equivalence, although that's been somewhat restricted in the new regulatory framework called Medical Device Regulation, or MDR. And finally, for medical devices, the way in which they are used or implanted can have a significant impact on the outcomes with that device. So the usability or the human factors and training of surgeons are really important in the medical device world. Next slide. This is some findings from the CoreMD project. We focused on 3 high-risk clinical specialisms: orthopedics, cardiology, and devices used for diabetic medicine. This graphic represents findings from a systematic review where we focused on cardiovascular products. Just to explain the graphic, here you can see 2 sets of graphs, and the dotted line represents the time when the product was marketed. And this was a systematic review of all published clinical evidence for 73 high-risk devices used in cardiology. From this graph, you can see most studies are done after a product receives its CE marking. And you can see in the top graphic the blend between randomized controlled trials or non-randomized controlled trials. And you can see from the image there that most devices aren't supported by randomized controlled trials, and most evidence is generated after the product has already been marketed. So in a very simple sense, we can see that in the medical device system, we often allow much greater uncertainty about clinical outcomes at the time of marketing of a new and high-risk cardiovascular implant. Next slide, please. There were many findings in the CoreMD project. We have over 30 manuscripts published in peer-reviewed journals, but there are also data sets and tools and lots of other resources that you can get via the 2 links here, linking to the webinar, but also linking to the library associated with the project. Next slide, please. And we could go through. So in this next section, we'll talk about the medical device regulation. This was a framework that was passed into law in 2017, and it has a phased implementation time, which will run now until 2028. There has been significant challenges with implementing the medical device regulation. And just to give you a brief summary of some of those challenges, we have seen challenges with clinical evidence and transparency. So the example with high-risk cardiovascular devices coming to market without high-quality trials is one example. A lack of available clinical evidence, as well as high costs of certification. These have an overall impact on the introduction of new technologies or innovation in the sector. And there are also needs to strengthen stakeholder involvement and collaboration to reduce regulatory complexity and to improve governance. Next slide, please. This is just one graphic taken from an Austrian public health institute that are monitoring activity within the regulatory framework. You can see here the headline figure that 47% of manufacturers will either stop production or in the future will stop production of some of their medical devices. And in the clinical community, this can raise challenges when the withdrawal of that product might limit your therapeutic options. A last option device may disappear and you cannot any longer do that intervention, or a device may disappear and you have to use an alternative that may be more complex or difficult. Next slide, please. So at Biomed Alliance, we've been developing essential principles of what an ideal regulatory system should look to achieve for medical devices. Just to briefly introduce them, we think that there should be much greater transparency and all clinical evidence should be publicly shared. We need to adopt better methods using regulatory science, and we have to introduce greater proportionality across the wide range of products that are available. We need greater predictability and flexibility, and we have to allow specialized pathways for things like orphan devices or breakthrough technologies. We have to improve the ways that our system is interactive, both for developers and for other stakeholders, and we have to improve efficiency in the system. Next slide. So I won't go through in detail all of the solutions here. I'll show you a link in a moment where you can go to read further information. But we have a variety of solutions proposed at Biomedical Alliance to improve clinical evidence and transparency, to reduce the transparency of costs that people pay to notify bodies for their assessments, recommendations to improve the availability of orphan and pediatric devices because these are particularly challenged with high costs and complexity for market introduction, and further measures to mitigate the risk of devices that are disappearing when they're necessary for healthcare. Next slide. Other solutions that we recommend is specialized pathways to foster innovation. to strengthen stakeholder involvement, to reduce regulatory complexity, and to streamline governance. Next slide, please. There has been a lot of suggestions about the range from suggestions to have an agency type model, to having a medical device office, to having a new entity, or to introducing new steps for assessments by notified bodies. At Biomedical Alliance, we recommend expanding the role of the European Medicines Agency. They're currently responsible for expert panels, but we think that there could be a lot more work that the European Medicines Agency could do to strengthen coordination, provide innovative pathways, and to ensure robust oversight and alignment in a decentralized system. Next slide, please. If you would like to read more, you can find the links here to our policy documents. We have produced one for medical devices and one for in vitro diagnostics. And in the coming weeks, we'll have a much longer report that will provide further background and rationale for the recommendations presented today. So hopefully I've kept reasonably to time, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, you have kept to time. And thanks for all the links. They're, again, really interesting and really rich. So last but certainly not least for this section, I'd like to hand over to Marta Bragnognolo, excuse my Italian pronunciation. And Marta is from the Global Health Hub, and she's going to talk to us about patient engagement, her experiences in the cardiovascular area of device development. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Josephine. It's actually Bragagnolo, but I know it's weird. Also, in some cases, Italians don't pronounce it well, so I'm used to it. It's not a problem. So, as Josephine said, I work for Global Heart. I actually am Global Heart project manager and patient engagement executive, focus mainly on the successful management and implementation of EU-funded projects while fostering relationship with patients and stakeholders across Europe. I am also a EUPATI fellow, cohort 5. Whoop, whoop. I saw some of you are here, so hi to everyone. And let's start with a brief overview of who Global Heart Hub is. So next slide, please. Thank you. Global Heart Hub is the first global non-profit alliance of heart patients organizations established to create and unite a global cardiovascular patient community. So at the moment, we count more than 130 patient organizations affiliates, stemming from more than 40 countries all over the world, with representations in all the continents. In the next slide, I have summarized our main activities. So as an organization, we focus mainly on 4 key areas. We unite heart patients organizations worldwide to foster collaboration and share resources. We ensure that patients and caregivers are recognized as equal stakeholders in healthcare systems, in their personal healthcare decisions as well. We empower the patients, organizations, and patient advocates themselves through training and resources to effectively advocate for their communities. And finally, we contribute to research initiatives that highlight patient experiences and needs, ensuring then that these insights are actually used to inform innovations in the healthcare environment. In the next slides, next slide. So here now we can go a bit into the current status of patient engagement in medical devices. As an umbrella patient organization, we see that unfortunately there is limited active participation from patients in this field. So it was mentioned before. Many device designs are developed without sufficient input from patients, which can lead to products that do not fully meet patient needs. So there's limited outreach to patient organizations, and when patient organizations and patients are actually contacted, the primary focus tends to be on the patient journey with the device rather than involving patients in the design process itself. In the next slides, I have summarized a bit the main reason of why it is important to involve patients in the development of and the designs of the devices. So engaging patients allow them allow also developers to know what features and what functionalities are most important to users. This will also lead to create devices that are tailored to patient needs and to their preferences. Patients will also provide insights on the usability of the devices, ensuring that they are intuitive and easy to use. This is particularly important for those devices that require self-management, such as the cardiac event monitors, but also devices developing devices that do not impede day-to-day activities. We've seen a lot of patients complaining about not being able to do their day-to-day activities because of the devices they have been installed for them. When patients feel that their voices are heard, it increases a sense of ownership and trust in the technology, enhancing their willingness to use the device. Patient engagements promote collaboration between developers and users, and this, as Bruno said, this can also lead to innovative solutions that can address unmet needs in healthcare and can inspire new ideas and innovations. Finally, many regulatory agencies encourage patient involvement in clinical studies for medical devices. This is because incorporating patient feedback can lead to more relevant study designs and outcome, and can also facilitate a smoother path to approval and market entry. Next slide, please. So one significant initiative addressing the involvement of patients in medical device design is and in medical devices in general, is the HUEFS project, which stands for Harmonized Approach to Early Feasibility Studies for Medical Devices in the European Union. So what are early feasibility studies? Next slide. EFS are limited clinical investigations that are conducted early in the development, and they are usually conducted before the device design has been finalized. And they are also used to gather feedbacks on the device concept and its clinical performance or effectiveness. Next slide, please. Here I have included a simple comparison with other types of studies for medical devices. As you can see here, EFS are conducted when the design of a device is not yet final, and they're to guide device modifications. Since it would be the first time the device is actually tested in humans, the risk linked to the devices are not yet well known, and therefore there is limited involvement of patients. Next slide, please. In Europe, EFS are regulated by several frameworks. However, there is an absence of a standardized procedural framework for EFS within the European Union, and this poses a risk to the EU competitiveness compared to other markets. This is why the EU project was, the HUEFS project was created. It aims to formulate recommendations for establishing an early feasibility studies programs within the EU, focusing on ensuring safe access to innovative medical devices while enhancing market competitiveness. The project started on October 2023, and it is expected to conclude in the second half of 2027. So check the project website, socials, and stay updated with project activities. Next slide, please. Here you can see the composition of the consortium. As you can see, the project sees the involvement of different stakeholders, such as academia, with Bocconi University as project leaders, but also Trinity College Dublin. We've seen before Tom, who is a partner of the project, healthcare providers, technology developers, with Edward Life Science as project coordinators, and patients organizations, which are EPF, the European Patients Forum, and us at Global Heart Hub. Next slide. To facilitate patient engagement throughout this project, we collaborate with two key groups, so the Patient Advisory Group and the Patient Engagement Ambassadors. The Patient Advisory Group consists of a group of 11 patients, all with different profiles, who provide valuable feedback based on their unique experiences, while the Patient Engagement Ambassadors, they are not patients. They are individuals with technical expertise, and they are part of the members of the consortium, and they help integrate patient perspectives across different work streams. In the next slides, we can see a bit the impact of early feasibility studies on patients. So the impact on patients can be significant. EFS provide timely access to innovative medical technologies that address unmet clinical needs while maintaining rigorous safety process. So here you can also see the impacts and benefits on other stakeholder groups. Next slides. Here I'm focusing a bit on the specific benefits and challenges that are associated with EFS for patients. So while an earlier access to new devices may improve the health outcome for patients, it also involves navigating uncertainty regarding risks when testing new concepts and new devices. Moreover, the eligibility criteria may be very strict. And since EFS involve a very limited group of patients, there will be limited accessibility of investigation sites. I conclude with the following slide. Yeah, thank you. That summarizes the importance of patient involvement. So as you can see here, patients can be involved in different phases of the device development, from identifying unmet needs to defining research priorities, study design, review proposal, and much more. And this is vital to create effective solutions that truly meet patient needs. So thank you for your attention today. And I look forward to your questions if you have, and to the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Marta. Yeah, and just to reiterate, any questions for later on, if you can put them in the Q&A box, that would be brilliant. So we're now moving forward now to sort of an open multi-stakeholder panel discussion. So we have Ella Balassa, who is a EUPATI fellow, Annika Eberstein from Philips, welcome back Bruno, and Marta. And we're also joined by Claudia Luati from the European Patients Forum. And as I say, this is going to be sort of quite just a more sort of relaxed chat, really, with a few things that I think that it's important that we cover. And the previous presentations have really highlighted certain things for me. So number one is the disparity, historical or otherwise, between patient involvement in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. I'm just wondering, are there any lessons that perhaps we can learn in terms of patient engagement in medical devices that we can learn from the pharmaceutical industry? Are there any that you can think of? Are there any sort of commonalities that devices share with pharmaceuticals? In that case, what about the priorities? So, you know, you mentioned about priority setting before, Bruno in particular. What can we do to ensure that patients are at the start of engagement activities and device development? I'm not sure if I can see everybody, Jana.
I think Tom raised his hand.
Right, sorry, I can't see everybody on the screen. Hi, yes, sorry. Hi, Tom.
Hi, maybe just to start the discussion, I think that we have really different regulatory systems for medicines versus medical devices. And from my experience, authorities have been starting to engage with patient representatives as part of general outreach activity, but bringing that into assessment domains is something which is very limited. I have seen some green shoots. For example, I think that in the United Kingdom, post-Brexit, they're developing their own framework, but for post-market surveillance or the monitoring done by medical device companies, some of their revised law will require greater patient engagement between those manufacturers and patient representatives. So we're starting to see some greater involvement. I think that Bruno's graphic developed with EUPATI was really nice because it shows all of the various opportunities that there are. When we think about clinical evidence generation in trials for investigational devices or new devices, I think that there's a lot of importance in bringing a patient voice to development cycles happening with trial development. I don't think that this is currently a standard practice with national competent authorities around Europe, though. So I think it would be good to try and develop where are the key areas where patients could help. And I'd suspect that that activity will probably mostly happen between the developer and patients, but should be reflected in the technical files and then submitted to the authorities. That could be maybe a useful first step.
Do you think that one of the issues is that there's far more public awareness of what pharmaceuticals are compared to medical devices? Sorry, Bruno, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. I was taking on what Tom was saying, but I can go on exactly what we said now. It's true. I give classes in the university, first year degrees, and I always give a small presentation about the medical devices sector. And the awareness of the population about the importance of medical devices is quite low when they put in the same place medicines and medical devices. I always give the example that when you enter in a hospital, you are surrounded with medical devices and you are talking about medicines that are going to be given to the patient. So that there's actually a very we are the poor partner of the health sector, but a very important one at the same level of pharmaceuticals. And to go on what and your first question, one of the priorities that we need to have in this field is like start to training patients also in the medical device sectors in programs so big and well structured like EUPATI was 10 years ago for the pharmaceutical in Europe. Because, for example, I know that EUPATI is being an effort to bring medical devices to the field and to the agenda, but actually we still need to do a lot of it, because having patient experts in medical devices, it's not exactly the same of a patient expert in medicine, because the life cycle is quite different. Regulations are quite different, as Tom also said, and the environment that is being created to involve patients, it's also have some similarities, but has different perspectives. The way interaction of patients with the teams from medical devices is done is we have a much bigger proximity in the early stages of medical devices and needed than, for example, in pharmaceuticals. So there's a quite different scenarios, and training patients to be an active part is quite important. So that for me is an important priority at this time.
If I could add a couple
So we need,
of
yes, of course, Ella, go ahead.
And maybe I could just introduce myself briefly, since I haven't spoken
Yes.
yet on the panel. My name is Ella Balassa. I am a patient advocate living with cystic fibrosis, which is a rare genetic lung disease. I was also part of the EUPATI, I'm a EUPATI fellow, part of cohort 6, so in 2023. And as part of my advocacy and patient engagement involvement, I've worked with a number of different stakeholders, from nonprofit groups to pharma companies and life science technology companies, on bridging the gaps between the healthcare industry and patients and bringing the patient voice into drug development. And so from my personal care and from living with cystic fibrosis, I've had to use numerous different medical devices, nebulizers, breathing treatments, devices that measure blood oxygen levels in my body. I've done breathing tests through spirometers, a number of different devices like that, some which I have in my home that connect to my local clinic and feed data back to my doctor. I've not been a part of a device trial, nor have I really had, and kind of makes sense given the limited scope of patient involvement in medical devices. I've not actually personally had any involvement in the development of devices. And for context, I'm based in the US. So, but I given from the presentations, I've understood and kind of see the similarities between, the lack of regulatory guidance and really requirements from the FDA here in the US for medical device companies on how to, or really just engaging patients in that development. There is some FDA guidance from, it was a number of years ago, I'd say maybe in like 2022 or even before that, where the FDA released with the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, which is a committee of patient representatives, and they came up with sort of guidelines around how to engage patients in the development of medical devices. But again, this document, or these are just sets of guidelines, as we've talked about. There's no regulation around that. But maybe to go back to answering your initial question, Josephine, of how patients can really be included in the development of medical devices, and this is not to belabor some points that have already very well been articulated and shared. But I think that there is a really need for patients in the involvement in like the design and the conceptualization, right, of like understanding what features would be valuable, and understanding pain points of patients, and how can usability and comfort and functionality be improved. And then, of course, as Bruno was just speaking about, getting patients' involvement through these advisory roles, specifically for patients that have various conditions, and to understand for example, the device that's actually intended for that population. And this can just provide that wealth of understanding and guide that development. Of course, obviously in the clinical trial space, and getting feedback on the study design and the feasibility of the trial, and endpoints, which leads to then, of course, like gathering patient preference data, and using patient-reported outcome measures to really understand too how this device is improving quality of life, and the relief of symptoms, and the ease of the use of the device. And then again, to what was pointed out before, is really even after such a trial has taken place, really understanding in the real world context how this device is fitting into and supporting patients' long-term needs. And then that's when these long-term issues can be identified too, and iterated upon. So you think that there's a lot of different ways and opportunities for patients to be involved. And obviously this is something that we need to work on a global scale. And having conversations like these, I guess, is a good start.
Yeah, I think what's key is that I think priority setting hasn't always been done with patients in mind, and I think that's for pharmaceuticals as well. But particularly when we look at devices, what matters to patients suffering from that illness? How can they use them? Are they viable? And I just think that speaks to involving patients right from the drawing board, right from the start, rather than halfway through, which is what sometimes happens. Anika, from an industry perspective, have you got any thoughts on how you go about doing that?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Annika Eberstein from Philips. So not here for the coffee machines or the toothbrushes, but our broad health technology portfolio. And I maybe just to give a few thoughts on how we actually innovate, because I do think it's different from what many colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry do. And we do innovate quite a bit. So Philips is one of the leading innovators worldwide. We hold more than 50,000 patents in the technology area. And the way that we always start is with a real world problem, because our ideas don't come from a lab, they come from the healthcare environment. And one of the ways that we actually find those problems quite literally is just going out into hospitals and ask. So Philips employees in research and innovation are encouraged to do field visits, and that could look like, just go to a hospital, shadow the work, and talk to not only, of course, the physicians and the technicians and the nurses, but also the patients that are going, for example, in imaging procedures, their families that are waiting with them, and ask, how do you experience this? Are you feeling good doing this? How annoyed on a scale from 1 to 10 are you that you now have been waiting here for an hour and a half while nothing is happening? After the procedure, what did you like? What did you not like? And then once we know, okay, what problems do we actually want to solve? Every innovation that Philips is working on has to perform on 4 aspects. So the first is, of course, better health outcomes. So, well, improving the health of the individual or populations in some cases as well, because again, medical technologies also sometimes work at system level. Then, of course, patient experience beyond. So I think there was a lot of talk here about the regulatory aspects, and that's really important. Safety and performance is, of course, the minimum standard that we need to fulfill, and usability is a huge part of that because it has an incredible impact on the performance of the device. But experience goes further than that. Because you also want to create an experience for the patient or the user, which is of course not always the patient, that also works for them, that addresses quality and creates satisfaction. And I think that goes for both the patient, but also for the staff. And then we do also evaluate our innovation on cost of care, because in the end, it's also about efficiency of the system. And that is also something that the people purchasing our technology care about. And so once we have understood what the issue is, what we often do, especially in relatively early phases of design projects, is co-creation sessions. So in Eindhoven, which is one of our European design and research centers, we have a fake hospital and a fake flat, actually, because there's, of course, technology also used at the home. And we essentially put people around a table and say, okay, like, this is a problem. Maybe there's already a prototype. That sometimes happens. So you have a prototype of a device, and then you talk it through. Okay, for example, if we look at remote care for pregnant people. So, okay, you may have a sensor with an app. Does maybe the sensor hurt you, your belly? Is it uncomfortable? How can we change that? I think it's also about the different users you have potentially for a device, which again may be different depending on the device type. I mean, that's the beauty of medical technologies. It's really everything. So if it's a defibrillator, then it must be usable by anybody on the street. So how do you design that? You need to test with people to see, okay, we're developing a software that guides you orally through the entire process of providing defibrillation, and it has sensors to give you feedback if you actually applied the defibrillator correctly. Does that work for you or not? Another example maybe to give is a few years ago, first of all, I think everybody realizes that imaging procedures sometimes are uncomfortable. No? I mean, undergoing an MRI scan is not an experience that anybody likes to do, even if it is medically necessary. But there was a realization also coming in the feedback from families that especially children really don't like scans. And that meant that a lot of them needed to be sedated or undergoing anesthesia, which is a problem because, first of all, children may react badly to anesthesia. There may be health issues afterwards. And in general, of course, it does not contribute to a positive experience. So what we did is created a software for gamification of the entire process. So there's now an elephant that in an app that goes with the child through the procedure, explains it to them, and then also during the procedure, the elephant is there and kind of explains it while you're doing the scan and so on. So that's the kind of thing we try to do.
Thanks, Annika. Really tangible examples. I just wanted, Claudia, I wanted to bring you in anyway, but I can see that you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. No, I just wanted to react to some of the points that were made. And I think it's very interesting, the way that industry goes about identifying the needs, identifying how to prioritize innovation. And perhaps something that was missing in the past in the medical devices industry is that the primary user, the primary customer was perhaps considered to be the healthcare professional rather than the patient, because of course there is this surgical aspect, and it's providing a tool, to the doctor in order to serve the patient. So in that sense, I think as we see many different devices now coming onto the market that have direct patient interactions, that have direct patient impacts, perhaps that will also help actually bringing in the patient perspective into the device development in a more natural way, let's say. And I just wanted to get back to what Bruno was saying in his presentation, regarding the use of prompts and the necessity to ensure that those patient-reported outcomes are actually validated, which is something that we saw, as part of R&D that Tom was presenting earlier. EPF did some focus groups, and we also worked with the University of Gothenburg to do a literature review of available prompts. And that's really something that we saw, that at the moment, there are not a lot of validated tools. Not all of them are always used, as part when prompts are collected, it's not always the relevant ones that are collected, and they're not necessarily very condition specific either. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of just also building the instruments in order to standardize the patient participations in the development.
Claudia, thank you. I think one thing that I'm really struck by, and Claudia just spoke about it, is that increasingly devices are being used independently of healthcare professionals in the home. And as we say, the increase in software as a medical device. So we've spoken about engaging with patients, but I think one really difficult area for me is the issue with how ethical are some medical devices. So we know that there are gender disparities, there are disability disparities, there are ethnicity disparities and biases, which are sometimes inadvertently, but they're built into some devices. What can we do to ensure that they are built out? Because I'm sometimes conscious that not everybody has a seat at the table. So we work with patient organisations. Do we need to do more? And how do we go? And who do we work with to do more to ensure that the health inequalities are reduced? Does anybody have? Claudia, thank you.
Yeah, I can try to answer that question, although it's very, very difficult, And I have to say the recent developments of the FDA having to take down some of the information that is available on promoting diversity is very, very concerning in that sense. So, but again, this is only something I think you can achieve through regulation, and through ensuring that the models and the devices, the software is actually trained on diverse data, and that's something that is necessary. We just started a project, but I think it's mostly related to drugs, of improving diversity in clinical trials in Europe, and there are some very big barriers in terms of, for example, some legislation in some country doesn't even allow the collection of ethnicity data, for example. So I think we really need to look at what are the barriers at the moment, including legislation, and in the way that we develop these devices, and really ensure that there is a requirement to have AI and other software actually trained on data in order to be as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another couple of comments. Tom and then Annika, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then Marta. Thanks, Marta.
I'll be very brief. I completely agree with what Claudia has just said. And from my experience, when we think about the broad array of medical devices, so 500,000 things and probably another couple of 100,000 digital health applications, where we're not entirely sure how many of them meet the definition of a medical device or are appropriately regulated, the Apple app and Google Play Store kind of apps. I think that if we divide them out, when you think about the physical products, As a system, we should try to determine where certain products may have different outcomes based on subpopulations. So people may have heard of the challenge with pulse oximeters, and that's something that really came to the fore during COVID. Because for certain populations, these pulse oximeters really weren't validated and didn't work very well. So for physical products and hardware, we need to understand where that might be a challenge and then apply particular requirements there. For software, it's a completely different challenge. And when we think of artificial intelligence-enabled medical devices, that training data and understanding the populations that has been studied on is something where I think we have a real challenge, and we have to do better to understand where there might be different outcomes from the algorithm based on the populations it was trained on and then applied to after it's marketed. I think this is something where we don't have very much policy in Europe for AI-enabled medical devices yet. With the new AI Act, it's something where we'll have to follow it closely to see if the explainability and transparency of information about those algorithms and how they've been trained, that might help us to understand. And there are some very nice methods that the US FDA would have. A simple example would be if you had a AI radiology software. It might be approved for mammography screening generally, but maybe not validated for a population that might have breast implants, for example. And FDA would have very good methods such as multi-reader, multi-channel assessments, where you can go and check the human versus algorithm generated recommendations to see, do they work for particular populations? So we probably need a greater emphasis on those validation steps when there might be different outcomes between populations.
Thank you, Tom. Annika and then Marta. Thanks.
No, so I think it's definitely an important issue, and we as Philips do have AI principles, which include fairness, so that we develop software without bias and discrimination. I do think that the Artificial Intelligence Act, which includes all medical devices that are AI enabled, has some very clear requirements that you need to reduce, and if you cannot reduce completely, mitigate any bias in the algorithm. So from a legal point of view, that would be for me the tool to enforce that. Of course, my understanding is that then for medical devices specifically, the MDCG is going to develop further guidance on how the AI Act applies to them. And I think that is something where, of course, patient representatives need to be involved to set the right methodologies.
Thank you, Annika. Yeah, it goes back to that sort of patients having agency when it comes to sort of setting those things from the start rather than later on when it's often too late, or it then becomes tokenistic. Marta.
Yeah, I will be brief and I will build up to what's already been said, which is extremely valid. But in most cases, we see that medical devices are built and are tested on men. So the most important inequality is the difference between men and women. Like the hormone level that changes throughout the month is not taken into consideration at the moment in majority of medical devices with the AI integrated. So if we need to start somewhere, we should start in this specific area.
Yeah, I will share an anecdote with you that I was involved in a project, and when they came to us, it was developing a prosthetic arm, and that development had been on a male arm, and they wanted just to roll it out onto women and then children. And I think that speaks to a persistent, sometimes persistent or industry not really taking due account, or there still seems to be a block, and I'm actually not sure what we can do about that. But I think that it's an ongoing problem, and if we are going to be serious about sort of reducing inequalities and making sure that medical devices are optimized for everybody, then those barriers do need to be. And I just wonder whether or not any of you think that funders have a role in that. So I know that there's a few people on here from the UK. There are from Europe. There are various funding bodies that allocate resources to industry, often industry and university collaborations. Do they have a role in actually sort of being more, asking more requirements on those developing medical devices to reflect what we've just spoken about? Annika.
I don't want to take the floor if anybody
No,
else
no.
is. But I do actually, first of all, yes, they absolutely do, and they should. And second, I actually do have practical experience with that, because I was sitting at the table when we developed the Innovative Health Initiative together with the European Commission. So that's a public-private partnership funding health research between not only the medical technology, but also the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry and the European Commission. I was in a different role at the time, but Philips is also very engaged in projects now under IHI. And I think there are a few ways that we really found it important to involve patients and patient advocates here. And I think that also was based on lessons learned in IMI, because we changed a lot compared to IMI, but we also try to take over those things that really worked. And the first is that I think funding bodies also need to consult with patients at the moment of setting the priorities and challenges that they want to see addressed. So we did quite a broad public consultation when developing the research and innovation agenda. We got a lot of feedback there from patient associations and individual patients. I know because I read all of those submissions and was one of the people trying to integrate them. There is, of course, also a patient representative in the Science and Innovation panel. So anytime there's a draft topic, their views are being sought. And I think there is a clear encouragement that any project that is being funded needs to include patient associations in the consortium, or if that somehow is not possible, to have some kind of patient advisory group. I mean, we as Philips are now engaged in several projects. So one, for example, in a project together with the Dutch Liver Patient Association and the Lung Cancer Foundation, and another one with the European Alliance of Stroke Survivors. So I think that's really valuable. And I think that's something that should be required by funders.
Great. I'm just actually looking at some of the Q&As which have come through, and I think it'd be useful if the panel were to sort of maybe think about some of those. And I'm looking at one for, I'm looking at, let me have a look here. Steve Book, hi Steve, and he's asking, when we work with medical device companies and the inclusion of public and patients isn't involved, how can the EUPATI community work to lobby for greater patient and public involvement, but also IWS as well? Does anybody have any insights? Does anybody from any, hi Bruno.
Hi. Well, I can tell you a small experience that we have, because we at Portuguese EUPATI NP, we are young yet for now, but how can EUPATI work? For example, here in Portugal, our representatives are involved more and more with the Content Authority, Infarmed, and the initiatives that Infarmed is launching for engagement of patients. And at those groups and those discussions, we can advocate for not for changing the law, because the regulatory field already gives engagement of patients in all of these steps, but to make aware for the companies the need to be there and make the regulatory bodies open to consider how the results from the research coming from the companies is being made. For example, to be clear about where did they introduce patient perspective, where patients were involved during that process of research. So we are doing a kind of lobbying in that way. asking them to be permanently looking for that. And of course, training patients every day so that they can participate actively on all this agenda.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I think one of the things that we haven't necessarily discussed is how we can equip patients and how we can equip members of the public to actually have the confidence to engage. So Bruno, I think you mentioned training there. Do any of you have any sort of experience on that? Because for me, there's often an issue of capacity building that, I mean, I know EUPATI is great in sort of developing those skills, but there are thousands and thousands of people out there that have not accessed EUPATI. What do you think are the sort of key things that we can do to build capacity and confidence amongst patients to be able to sort of sit at the table equally as equal partners with regulators, with developers, and with clinicians? Ella, thank you.
Yeah, you know, I think that, well, obviously EUPATI is a fantastic platform, and you know, they're really training patients on the various different aspects of, you know, how to be involved in drug development through, you know, regulatory, engaging with various stakeholders. You know, I think as far as some initiatives that I personally have been involved in, and, you know, I think that each disease area and a lot of, I'd say, patient advocacy organizations here in the US at least have had major roles in the training and, you know, in helping to support patients in their empowerment, in, you know, gaining, as you said, like comfortability and, you know, being able to communicate with physicians. First, I think that's where it starts, is that the patients have to be comfortable with relaying their needs and their feelings and kind of the empowerment within their own clinical care. And then once that's sort of established, that's how they can then become more involved and interested and sort of be this voice for their community more broadly. And so, you know, I think, for example, I've worked with the sepsis, two examples that I can think of. One, I've worked with the Sepsis Alliance, and they are developing, you know, a patient training where it's really just, you know, covering and explaining how, you know, patients are involved in, you know, protocol design, for example, or optimizing clinical trials, and or how they, you know, how they can engage with different stakeholders and what those opportunities and what those engagements actually look like, and through providing real life examples. You know, like if a pharmaceutical representative, maybe through like a focus group, says something that maybe the patient doesn't agree with, how can a person, you know, kind of rebuke that or say, you know, how they feel about something without feeling, you know, that their perspectives don't matter, or that they're maybe, you know, not being listened to or something. So it's really, I think it's important to get very granular and really discuss a lot of these different, the nuances, and really just the small examples of how to empower oneself. So, you know, that training, for example, is for patients that have dealt with sepsis. There's another thing that I'm familiar with that's doing in the cancer space.
Sorry, Ella, can I not to shut you off at all, but I just need to move on to Bruno and then Claudia, and then before we just have a few minutes of questions. So absolutely, yeah, please include it later on. That'd be brilliant. Thank you. So I've got Anika and then Claudia. Thank you. And then we're going to move on. I just want to sort of look at a couple of from the Q&A, and maybe we can respond to those. Anika?
I think one of the very practical ways I think that we can also do better in the industry is also to gather with those organizations that we traditionally anyways collaborate and where we have partnerships with. So especially the scientific societies, the representatives of the medical disciplines, the hospitals. And I do think that you see a change, maybe to get some optimism into this group. So if you look at especially radiology, the European Society of Radiology actually did did set up a patient advisory group in 2013. And that's really one of the ways that also radiologists realized, okay, we need to be better at listening to our patients. They are not just objects to be moved through the procedure, but we really need to collaborate with them. And I think that's also one way for us as industry, because it's a radiologist that are often our first contacts, our first partners for innovation. And I think that's one channel that is already established and could be improved.
Great, Claudia, and then finally Bruno, and then I'm just we'll respond to a couple of questions, I think.
Yeah, I can just mention perhaps, I think increasing the awareness of what medical devices are and how they're regulated, even just in the general population, would already help compared to pharmaceuticals. I believe that we can still improve the way that medical devices are perceived. And then, of course, on the training, for example, when you look at medicines, the EMA provides some of the training as well for patients that are involved in the regulatory process. So if there is a push from regulators to involve patients and to really promote it, I think they have a lot to do in terms of the training. And then, of course, patient organizations are always struggling with resources. So what helps also is really supporting actually the patient movement and that patient empowerment more generally.
Great, thank you, Claudia. And then, Bruno, thank you, Bruno.
Very, very quickly, because I said that one of the priorities should be the training of patient experts in the medical device, but we cannot forget that you need to train also the researchers. I'm coming from the academia, and one of the major problems is that a lot of innovation gets out from the academic to small and medium enterprises that have nice products and nice innovation that is not characteristic of our sector in Europe. Very small companies developing high specialized medical devices. But from the academic, we don't have any idea how to involve patients. If you want patients to be volunteer to talk with scientists and give their opinion, you also need to train our researchers and academics to know how to listen to patients in this discussion. That is quite important, because otherwise this is only one-way talk and not two-way talk.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that, because there's an anonymous attendee who, and I can appreciate this, who has actually suggested that researchers are going, actually in their comments, researchers go against the grain of working with patients that come from the same type of demographic, but also that they do not want to be questioned, and a lot of the decisions are made. So I'll share actually an experience with you that I think sometimes organisations, so in the UK, academic institutions are actually heavily involved in medical device, certainly the design and sometimes implementation. But there's the term critical friend, and I think that sometimes they want the friends, they don't want the critique. And I've noticed actually that in many respects, or lots of respects, patient and public involvement seems to be going backwards, that there is an increasing selection of what one might say are easy patients around the table, to the exclusion of everybody else. I just wonder whether anyone else has had experience of that, or whether it's my being cynical based on my experiences. Well, that's positive. I'd be interested in afterwards, actually. I think it's probably a useful exercise to collect as many. Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, I can just mention, I think it's just what we said about the change of culture that is needed, is that indeed what we advocate for, it's true in the context of clinical trials, it's true in the context of shared decision-making as part of healthcare practice as well, is that we want a dialogue, between the healthcare professional and the patient, where all the needs are considered and on an equal footing, and so I think in that sense, it's good to be challenged, and it's important to recognize that the patient perspective can indeed challenge assumptions, but that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, if we challenge, so EUPATI has a role in that, does anybody else, what can we do to actually sort of push back on resistance to involve patients meaningfully and ethically, and not just those patients that are already known? Is there anything, anybody got any insights that they'd like to share? I'm just wondering if, I mean, from a EUPATI perspective, I think that having the national platforms is, I think, really important, because we've discussed today, there are obviously so many regional variances. I'm from the UK, as are some other people attending this webinar. We have Ella from the US, we have someone online from Canada, those from Europe. And so obviously there are commonalities that we share, you know, as patients. I just wonder, is it an impossible thing to ask? But is there a way that we can sort of coalesce to drive this forward on a multinational level? You know, those that might work sort of across borders, or is that just something that is unrealistic, given that a lot of devices will be, you know, developed and implemented and used globally rather than just in individual countries? Just, I mean, it's something that sometimes I think when things are compartmentalized so much, and it really, there's a need to, and I think that that's a strength in EUPATI, to actually sort of lessons learned and actually, you know, positive things, good exemplars of what is being done to sort of drive that cohesiveness. Tom, in terms of regulation, certainly from the UK perspective, unfortunately with Brexit, so we're having to sort of go our own way. In your experience, are you seeing sort of positive changes since the changes in device regulation?
There are some green shoots, I would say. So, you know, for example, we have had changes in our regulation in Europe that has increased transparency requirements, but we don't see that fully implemented in practice. So just to give you a couple of brief examples, if as a clinician or patient you want to understand a trial that has been completed for a new device that comes to market, the law says that the clinical investigation report has to be publicly available, and where relevant, that has to have a link so you could get an impression of the study that was undertaken. One of the practical challenges is that we don't have a single database to host these reports in yet. There's something called EUDAMED, the European database on medical devices, that's very delayed. So there was a new initiative in recent months to put a repository as a short-term measure, but I think there's only maybe 3 trials currently in that repository, or there were the last time I checked. And I think we would have a lot more work to do to get all of those trials publicly available, but then also check the ones that have a layperson summary to see, is that truly understandable to laypersons? Because this can have real clinical effects. Depending on the technology, a clinician may really need to see the actual data that was accrued to make the best decision for the individual patient that they're engaging with. So I think that's one thing that's improved in law, but not yet in practice. And just one brief comment on where patients might best... Oh, sorry.
I think just because we need to draw things to a close, yeah. I think that, you know, we started talking about an information gap, and we've closed in talking, you're referring to an information gap. And I think that's perhaps a key takeaway, and how we communicate devices to, and their safety, but also their benefits, and how they can become involved to as wide a population as possible. I would, obviously EUPATI has a role with that, their training platform. I'm not sure, those of you who are attending, how well you are aware of it, but I would certainly suggest that there's a whole host of different modules on there, and I think that they provide a really rich resource for anybody that is interested. I would like to thank everybody on this call. We have by no means covered everything that we perhaps wanted to. I don't feel that we've been able to respond to all the really important questions that came from those attending. I think there's some really interesting ones about the sort of politics and inclusion. By politics, I mean with a small p, not politicians. And I think some really sort of ethically things that are really, really vital to ethically consider, actually, so that the work that patients do isn't taken advantage of, and that we really are valued. So I would like to thank Annika, Bruno, Claudia, Tom, Ella, and Marta. I think Marta's poorly, so well done for her for staying the course. And Jana, obviously, for sort of doing all the background work behind this. I think that moving forward, we will try and capture some of those questions and look at how we can respond to those and communicate with those, that everyone that's attended today. So I'd really like to thank everybody for coming, but also particularly those that have participated. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.